I'd been working the night shift at the Duluth aerial lift bridge for 11 years when everything changed. 11 years of 10-hour stretches in a glass-walled control booth 60 feet above the harbor, watching ore boats and tankers slide through the canal like ghosts made solid. The booth wasn't much, 12 feet by 8, windows on 3 sides, the whole structure perched up there in the girders where the wind could get at it. Winter nights, the glass rattled in its frames. Summer, the heat turned it into a greenhouse that no fan could quite cool. But I knew it the way you know your own house in the dark. Every gauge had its particular quirk. The main hydraulic pressure indicator stuck at 40 psi until you tapped it twice with your knuckle. The bridge position readout flickered when the span hit the halfway point. Always had. Probably always would. The backup generator switch required a specific angle of pressure or it'd slip right back to the off position before the contacts engaged. 11 years of muscle memory. My hands could work the console in a blackout. The machinery sang its own song too. The main lift motor had a bass hum that dropped a quarter tone when it strained. The cable drums squeaked on the third rotation. Someone had greased the bearings wrong back in '98, and they'd never been quite right since. The descent brake released with a metallic sigh that echoed through the girders. I could tell you the bridge's position with my eyes closed, just from the sounds. Most nights I sat up there alone with the coffee pot and the radio, waiting for the ore boats that came through in the small hours. The work itself was simple enough. A ship radioed approach. I checked the schedule and the weather, confirmed their tonnage and draft. Then I hit the warning lights, sounded the alarm, and brought the span up. 138 feet of steel roadway rising to let them pass beneath. Waited while they slid through, then lowered it back down. 4 minutes, start to finish, if everything went smooth. The Port Authority paid me to be reliable, to know the equipment, to not screw up and strand traffic on both sides of the canal or, worse, drop a few hundred tons of bridge deck on some freighter's wheelhouse. I was good at it. Good at the routine, good at the solitude, good at staying awake while the rest of Duluth slept. What I valued most, though, wasn't any of that. It was a laminated card someone had left taped beside the radio. 3 inches by 5, the edges yellowed and starting to curl despite the plastic coating. The tape holding it had been replaced so many times there were layers of residue built up on the metal panel, a geological record of adhesive. Bentley White had left it there. My predecessor. I'd never met the man. He'd retired 2 months before I started, moved to Arizona for his lungs, according to the supervisor who trained me on the equipment. But Bentley had worked this booth for 34 years. 34 years of night shifts in this same glass box, watching the same black water. The card contained 5 rules written in faded blue ink. Ballpoint pen, the kind that skips and blobs. His handwriting was cramped, letters squeezed together to fit the space. You could tell he'd written them carefully, though. No crossouts. No hesitation in the strokes. The Port Authority never officially acknowledged the rules. They weren't in any manual, weren't part of the training. But every operator eventually learned to follow them. Nathan Stevens, the security guard who did rounds at the Harbor Administrative Building, had mentioned them my second week. We'd been talking over the radio, slow night, no traffic, and he'd asked if I'd found Bentley's card yet. "The one by the radio?" I'd said. "That's the one. You read it?" "Yeah." "You follow it." "Should I?" Long pause on his end, static in the hiss of the channel. Then, "Yeah, you should." He didn't elaborate, didn't need to. I'd memorized the first 4 rules within a month. They were specific, concrete, the kind of thing you could actually do. Rule 1. Never raise the bridge after midnight unless you can see the vessel's running lights. Simple enough. If a ship radioed approach after midnight, I looked out the windows. If I could see their red and green navigation lights, their white masthead light, I brought the bridge up. If I couldn't see them, fog, malfunction, whatever, I told them to hold position until visibility improved or dawn broke, whichever came first. I'd had to enforce it twice. Both times the captains argued, both times I held firm. Protocol, I told them. Safety regulation. They didn't need to know it came from a laminated card, and not the operations manual. Rule 2. If the foghorn sounds 3 times without your activation, do not respond. The foghorn controls were in the booth. Big red button, safety cover you had to flip up. I was the only one who could trigger it. So if it sounded and I hadn't pressed the button, something else was wrong. Equipment malfunction, probably. Electrical short. In that case, Bentley's rule said to leave it alone. Don't investigate. Don't try to fix it. Let it sound until it stopped on its own. That one had happened 4 times over the years. 3 blasts, deep and resonant, rolling across the harbor. Each time I'd sat in my chair and waited, hands away from the controls, while the sound faded into silence. Rule 3. The shadow that passes beneath the bridge at 3:17 a.m. is not a ship. Specific time. Specific phenomenon. I'd seen it myself maybe 20 times. Always at 3:17 exactly. I'd checked my watch enough to be sure. A darkness in the water, moving west to east through the canal. Longer than any freighter. No lights, no sound, no wake. Just a shadow, like something massive sliding past underneath the surface. First time I saw it, I'd reached for the radio. Almost called it in. Then I remembered the rule. Sat back, watched it pass. Took about 90 seconds from when it entered the canal to when it disappeared past the breakwater. Not a ship. Fine. I didn't need to know what it was. Rule 4. When the water turns black, cut all exterior lights immediately. The harbor water was already dark at night, deep and cold, reflecting nothing. But sometimes it went black. Different kind of black. Absolute. Like the water had been replaced with a void. When that happened, I killed the bridge deck lights, the navigation markers, everything exterior. Sat in the booth with only the instrument panels glowing, waiting until the water returned to its normal dark gray. Happened maybe once a month. Never lasted more than 10 minutes. 4 rules. 4 specific instructions. I followed them, without question, because they'd kept Bentley alive for 34 years and they'd kept me safe for 11. Rule 5, though. Rule 5 remained smudged beyond reading. The ink had run or been worn away or something. The paper underneath had thinned to transparency where fingers had traced it. Decades of night shifts, dozens of operators before me, all of them touching that same spot, trying to read it, trying to understand what the 5th rule warned against. I'd tried everything, held it up to light, examined it with a magnifying glass, traced the impressions in the laminate. Nothing. Just a blur of faded blue and the ghost of letters I couldn't quite make out. Sometimes during the quiet hours between ships, I'd stare at it, run my own finger over that worn spot, adding my touch to all the others. Wondered what Bentley had been trying to say, wondered what was so important it had to be written down, but so terrible the words couldn't survive. The radio crackled at 11:47. I'd been watching the harbor lights reflect off Blackwater, counting the rhythmic flash of the North Pier beacon. Red every 4 seconds. Predictable. The kind of thing that kept you grounded during the long stretches when nothing moved and the booth felt suspended between water and sky. Bridge operator, this is Stevens at the Fitzgerald Memorial. Nathan's voice came through steady as always, but something in the careful way he said the words made me reach for the transmit button faster than usual. Go ahead, Nathan. Static filled the pause. Long enough I almost called again. The bell's ringing. He cleared his throat. Ship's bell. Been going for about 5 minutes now. 3 rings, then nothing. Wait maybe 30 seconds. 3 more rings. Just keeps repeating. I looked down at the canal below, at the museum ship's dark silhouette against the shoreline lights. The Edmund Fitzgerald Memorial had been docked there since 2003, a freighter repurposed to honor the wreck, the men lost. Visitors walked the deck in summer, touched the recovered artifacts, stood silent in front of the display cases. The bell sat in its own climate-controlled case, behind glass. I'd seen it once during a tour the city made us take, tarnished bronze still showing the markings from its time on the lake floor, 600 feet down for 20 years before they brought it up. Any wind down there? I kept my voice level. Dead calm. Nathan didn't elaborate, didn't need to. I checked the anemometer anyway, 3 miles per hour from the northeast, barely enough to stir the flags on the pier. Building vibration, maybe, I said. Something shifting in the exhibit. Bells mounted on dampeners. Hasn't moved in 20 years except when they clean the case. He paused again. I checked the logs, every entry going back. Nothing about spontaneous ringing. Nothing about any kind of movement. My eyes went to the laminated card tucked beside the radio. White with age now, corners soft from handling. Rules I'd never needed, written in Bentley's careful block letters. If the bell rings when no ship approaches, I pulled my attention back to the radio. You see anyone near it? Maintenance working late? Buildings locked down, just me and the exhibits. Nathan's baritone carried no fear, just that careful precision he used when reporting things that didn't fit normal patterns. Checked the case myself. Glass is secure. No one's touched it. I scanned the harbor through the booth's windows. Lake Superior stretched black and flat beyond the pier lights, disappearing into darkness where water met sky. No running lights. No movement except the gentle rise and fall of waves against the break wall. The schedule board showed nothing until 6:30 tomorrow morning. Algoma transport coming in with taconite from Silver Bay. Hold on. I pulled up the seismic monitors, the ones that tracked ground vibration from train traffic. The screens showed flat green lines. No rail movement since 9:40, nothing scheduled until the morning freight. Figured as much. Something creaked in the background of Nathan's transmission. Floorboards, maybe. It stopped about a minute ago, right before I called you. I pressed the transmit button, then released it without speaking. What was I supposed to say? That bells didn't ring themselves? That recovered artifacts stayed still and silent behind their glass? Nathan already knew that. Probably just settling, I said finally. Old ship, temperature changes, metal expands and contracts. In a climate-controlled case, not arguing, just stating facts. Yeah. The radio went quiet. I could picture Nathan in the museum's dim security office, surrounded by photographs of the Fitzgerald's last voyage. 29 men lost when she went down in 75. Worst storm in Lake Superior history, some said. Others claimed it wasn't the storm at all. I'd heard the theories during my years in the booth. Late-night radio calls with Nathan, stories passed between shifts. The lake didn't give up her dead, people said. Kept them in the cold and the dark, 600 feet down where the pressure turned everything strange. You want me to file a report? Nathan asked. Up to you. I watched the North Pier beacon flash. Red, red, red. Could just note it in your log. Unexplained sound. Case still secure. Right. He didn't sound convinced. Neither was I. Call if it starts again. Will do. Stevens out. The radio clicked to silence. I sat there looking at the laminated card. My hand wanted to reach for it, flip it over, read through the rules I'd memorized 11 years ago, rules that had never mattered until tonight. If the bell rings when no ship approaches, confirm all vessels' positions. The harbor stretched empty. No vessels to confirm. 3 rings. Silence. 3 rings again. I pulled the logbook toward me and made the entry. Time. Nathan's report. My response. Clinical language that turned something wrong into routine documentation. My handwriting looked steadier than my hands felt. Outside the booth, the wind picked up slightly. 5 miles per hour now. Not enough to explain anything. I thought about Bentley. Wondered if he'd ever gotten a call about the memorial bell, The museum hadn't opened until after his time, but Lake Superior had been pulling strange things from her depths long before they recovered that bronze and put it behind glass. My coffee had gone cold in its thermos. I drank it anyway, letting the bitter taste ground me in something normal, something that followed predictable rules. The harbor stayed quiet. The schedule board showed nothing. The instruments reported calm water, light wind, no traffic. But something had changed in that booth. In the air, maybe. In the way the darkness beyond the pier lights seemed thicker now, more present. I'd felt this before in smaller ways. Nights when the fog came in wrong, too fast and too complete. Mornings when ice formed in patterns that didn't match the temperature. Moments when the lake reminded you she was older than the city, older than the ships, older than anyone's understanding. Those nights I'd touched the laminated card and felt steadier. Bentley's rules, instructions for situations that shouldn't exist, but did anyway. Now I pulled the card from its place and held it under the booth's fluorescent lights, read through rules I could recite from memory. Rules about bells and fog and lights that moved wrong. Rules about voices on the radio using names they shouldn't know. The unease settled deeper, worked its way into my bones the way cold did during winter shifts. That particular feeling when your body understood something your mind didn't want to accept. Something was wrong with this night. The instruments said everything was fine. The harbor lay calm. The schedule showed nothing unusual. But the bell had rung 3 times, then silence. 3 times again. And I couldn't shake the feeling, certain as the steel under my feet, solid as the water below, that those rules I'd never needed were about to become very relevant. The fog came at 11:52. I saw it first as a thickening in the darkness beyond the North Pier, a paleness gathering where there shouldn't be any. Lake Superior didn't make fog in January. The air was too cold, too dry. The temperature differential was all wrong. But there it was, rolling across the black water toward the canal, moving against the wind. That's what made my hands go still on the logbook. The wind was coming from the northwest, had been all night, steady at 12 knots. I could hear it working at the booth's weather seals, that familiar whistle through the gaps. But the fog was moving southeast to northwest, pushing directly into the wind like something with intention behind it. I stood, moved to the south-facing windows where I had the clearest view of the canal approach. The fog pooled. That's the only word for what it did. Not drifted or rolled or spread. Pooled. It gathered around the concrete bridge supports the way liquid gathers around obstacles, thick and heavy and entirely too deliberate. I watched it accumulate in the angles where the massive pier met the canal walls, building up until it started to climb. Wrong. Everything about this was wrong. I'd seen fog on Superior. Real fog. Natural fog that came with the right conditions. Warm air over cold water in spring and fall. That thin gray haze that could swallow a freighter at half a mile. This wasn't that. This was dense, opaque, the color of old bone, and it moved with purpose. The shoreline disappeared first. Canal Park, with its hotels and tourist shops all dark for the winter season, just ceased to exist. One moment I could see the streetlights marking the curve of the road. The next, there was nothing but gray. The Maritime Museum went next, that distinctive building I'd looked at 10,000 times, gone as if it had never been there. The parking lots vanished, the pier lights, the breakwater. My booth became an island, suspended in nothing. I turned in a slow circle, checking every window. Gray pressed against the glass on all sides. Couldn't see the canal below, couldn't see the harbor behind, couldn't see the city lights that usually sprawled up the hillside to the west. Just the booth, hanging in empty space and that absolute wrongness of the fog that shouldn't exist. The temperature dropped, not gradually, not the slow cooling you'd expect from fog rolling in. The air inside the booth went from comfortable to freezing in the space between one breath and the next. Had to be 15 degrees at least, maybe 20. My breath came out visible. I watched it fog in front of my face, that white cloud hanging in air that had been warm enough I'd rolled up my sleeves an hour ago. The heating system was running. I could hear it, feel the air moving from the vents, but the cold kept coming, seeping through the walls, through the windows, through the very steel of the structure. I rolled my sleeves down. Didn't help. The cold had teeth. The phone rang. Not the radio. The hardline phone mounted on the control panel, the one connected directly to the Port Authority dispatch center. Black plastic receiver on a coiled cord, the kind of equipment they didn't make anymore, but that kept working year after year because it was too simple to break. I looked at it for 2 rings. 3. Lifted the receiver on the 4th. "Bridge operator," I said. "This is dispatch." Male voice, crisp and professional, with that particular clarity that came from good equipment and proper radio discipline. "I need you to execute an immediate raise for an incoming vessel." I didn't recognize the voice. Port Authority only had 3 regular dispatchers for the night shift, and I knew all of them. This wasn't any of them. "Identify yourself," I said. "Jason York, night dispatcher. I need that raise now, operator." Never heard that name. 11 years on this shift, and I knew everyone who worked the Port Authority Communication Center. Every voice, every speech pattern, every personal quirk. Jason York wasn't one of them. I pulled the logbook closer with my free hand, flipped back 3 pages to the dispatch roster I'd copied down at shift start. Standard procedure. Know who's working, know who might call. The night dispatcher was Nathan, same as always. No Jason York, listed. "I'm going to need a ship name and registration," I said. Kept my voice level, calm. The same tone I used for every communication, every shift, every vessel request. Didn't matter that my breath was still fogging in air that had no business being this cold, or that fog that couldn't exist was pressing against every window. "The Arthur M. Anderson," the voice said. "Inbound from the southeast, requesting immediate passage." My hand stopped moving on the logbook. The Arthur M. Anderson. I knew that name. Every person who'd worked the lakes long enough knew that name. The Anderson had been the last ship to communicate with the Edmund Fitzgerald before she went down in '75. Following behind her in the same storm, watching her disappear from radar, listening to her final radio calls. The Anderson had searched for survivors, found nothing but debris and oil slicks and questions that never got proper answers. I knew something else, too. The Anderson had been scrapped, not recently, years ago. Had to be at least a decade, maybe more. Broken down for parts and recycling, every rivet and plate accounted for. The Arthur M. Anderson didn't sail anymore. Couldn't sail. Didn't exist except in maritime history and the kind of stories old-timers told in harbor bars. "Registration number," I said. "I need that raise now, operator." Same crisp professional tone, no impatience, no irritation. Just absolute certainty that I would comply. "This is priority traffic." "Then you'll have the registration number." Silence on the line. Not the crackling silence of bad connection or atmospheric interference. Perfect silence, the kind that came from someone choosing not to speak. My eyes went to the rules taped beside the phone. Bentley's handwriting, that careful block printing I'd studied so many times the letters were burned into memory. Rule 2. If the foghorn sounds and you didn't activate it, do not raise the bridge under any circumstances. "I'm going to need proper identification," I said. "Ship name, registration, tonnage, and cargo manifest. Standard protocol." "The Anderson is inbound," the voice said. Each word precise, measured, absolutely certain. "Execute the raise." Not a request anymore. An order. The kind of voice that expected compliance, that had probably never been refused, that carried the weight of official authority and proper channels and all the infrastructure that made the Port Authority function. But I'd never heard of Jason York. and the Anderson had been scrapped years ago, and the fog was moving against the wind, pooling around the bridge supports, swallowing everything while the temperature dropped, and my breath hung visible in air that should have been warm. I hung up, just set the receiver back in its cradle, that plastic click loud in the sudden quiet. My hand was steady. Years of training, of procedure, of doing exactly what needed to be done without hesitation or second guessing. Rule 2. If the foghorn sounds and you didn't activate it, do not raise the bridge under any circumstances. The foghorn hadn't sounded, not yet, but the fog was here, impossible and wrong, and someone who didn't exist was calling about a ship that had been broken down for scrap, and every instinct I'd developed in 11 years of night shifts was screaming that the rules, those rules I'd never needed, never wanted to need, were about to become very goddamn relevant. The foghorn sounded 3 times from somewhere below, deep bass notes that didn't just reach my ears. They moved through the booth's windows, through the steel frame, through my chest cavity, the kind of sound you felt in your bones before your brain caught up to register it as noise. Each blast lasted maybe 5 seconds, with silence between them. Deliberate, measured. I stood frozen at the control panel, hands hovering over switches I hadn't touched. The horn shouldn't have been there at all. We decommissioned the bridge's fog signal system back in 2009, replaced it with the standard radio navigation alerts. The old horn itself had been removed. I'd watched the crew unbolt it from the South Pier foundation, watched them haul it away on a flatbed truck. But that sound, Christ, that sound was unmistakable. The exact pitch and rhythm I'd heard 1,000 times during my first years on the job. 3 blasts, 3 times, just like the radio static. My fingers twitched toward the lift controls. Every instinct I'd built over 11 years screamed at me to respond to a signal, to check the gauges, to do something. The bridge operator responds. That's the job. That's what keeps boats safe and schedules running and the whole system functioning. I pulled my hands back, gripped the edge of the console instead. Rule 2. Don't touch the controls between midnight and 1 a.m., no matter what I heard. The metal felt solid under my palms, real. I focused on that, the smooth painted steel, the slight vibration from the heating system, the tiny imperfections where other hands had worn the surface smooth over decades. Bentley's hands, the operators before him, all of them standing right here, holding this exact edge, all of them keeping their hands away from the controls. Movement caught my eye through the glass, not on the water's surface, below it. A darkness within the darkness, a shape rising from somewhere beneath the bridge itself. I stepped closer to the windows, close enough that my breath started fogging the glass. Too big to be a boat. Way too big. The shape kept coming, pushing up through the black water. Angular. Wrong. Boats moved horizontally, following the surface, obeying the basic physics of buoyancy and displacement. This thing was vertical, rising straight up from the canal floor like something surfacing from a dive, except the canal was only 28 feet deep, and this shape was already taller than that. My brain tried to make it make sense. Submarine, maybe. But no submarine operated in the Great Lakes, and even if one did, it wouldn't fit in a canal designed for ore freighters. The water around it started changing. I'd been watching that gray-black surface for hours, knew every shade of it under the dock lights. Now it was darkening. Not from fog or shadow, but from the water itself, like someone was pouring ink into the harbor, spreading out from where the shape rose. Gray to charcoal, charcoal to black, absolute black. My hand hit the light controls before I'd consciously decided to move. Rule 4. If the water turns black, kill all exterior lights immediately. The floods went dark. The deck lights. The navigation beacons I wasn't supposed to touch. Every switch got thrown, and the harbor plunged into darkness so complete it felt solid. My eyes hadn't adjusted yet. I was staring at nothing, at absence, at a void where the canal had been. Then I saw it. Not despite the darkness. Because of it. The shape was clearer now, edges sharp against the black water. A hull. Definitely a hull. Rising vertically straight up, water cascading from its surfaces in sheets that caught what little light remained from the distant shore. The sound of it hit me next. The rush and roar of tons of water pouring off steel, the deep groaning of metal under impossible stress. Not sailing, not floating, surfacing, like a whale breaching, like something coming up from depths that shouldn't exist in a canal that bottomed out at 28 feet. The deck came into view, twisted railings, structures that might have been cargo hatches or equipment housings, all wrong angles now, bent and warped. Rust showed in patches even in the darkness, great weeping stains down the hull. More water poured from the deck, from the railings, from every seam and joint. This thing had been underwater, deep underwater, for a long time. My throat had gone dry. I couldn't look away. The hull kept rising, revealing more of itself. Red paint showed through the rust, not bright red, faded, oxidized, the color of old blood, but unmistakable. That specific shade they'd used on ore carriers, that specific pattern of plating. I'd seen it in photographs, in the memorial displays at the Maritime Museum, in the documentary they played every November 10th at the Visitor Center, the Edmund Fitzgerald. The name didn't form in my mind all at once. It came in pieces, in fragments of recognition that my brain kept trying to reject. The hull shape, the railing configuration, that red paint, the way the superstructure was crushed and twisted, matching the sonar images from the wreck site. But the wreck site was 17 miles northwest of here, 530 feet down. The Fitzgerald had gone down in a November storm in 1975, taken all 29 crew with her, and she'd stayed down. They'd confirmed it, photographed it. The wreck was a grave site, protected by law. She couldn't be here. She was here. Rising toward the bridge I controlled, water still streaming from her broken decks, ascending from impossible depths in a canal that should have been empty except for winter ice and quiet water. The top of her superstructure cleared the surface, then kept coming, higher than the water, higher than the dock, rising toward my booth 60 feet up, and I realized with a clarity that felt like ice water in my veins that she wasn't going to stop. She was coming for the bridge. The radio crackled back to life at 11:58. Not the 3-beat pattern this time. Voices, dozens of them, overlapping, cutting through each other in waves of static and urgency. My hand jerked toward the volume knob before my brain caught up to what I was hearing. Bearing 270, winds northeast at 43 knots. Taking on water, forward compartments 3 and 4. Barometric pressure dropping 28.8 and falling. Different voices, different transmissions, all coming through my equipment at once, layered over each other until the words blurred into something that was almost music. Almost a song, the kind you didn't want to hear. I stood frozen at the console, watching the ghost ship hang there in the fog 60 feet below, and listened to men who'd been dead for half a century call out their final readings. Coordinates tumbled through the static, 47 degrees north, 85 west, weather reports in clipped professional tones that couldn't quite hide the strain underneath. Mayday signals that started calm and ended breaking. I knew these transmissions. Jesus Christ, I knew them. Every operator who worked the lakes learned about the Edmund Fitzgerald, the ore carrier that went down in 75, taking all 29 crew with her. They made us study the transcripts during training, made us memorize the timeline, made us understand how fast things could go wrong on Superior when the weather turned. I'd read Captain Joseph Austin's final communications 100 times, knew the cadence of his voice even though I'd never heard the actual recordings. "We are holding our own." That's what he'd said, right before the waves got too high and the hull gave out. Now his voice was coming through my radio, not a recording, not a replay from some archive, coming through my equipment, through channels that should have been empty, through frequencies that belonged to the bridge and nothing else. List increasing, starboard side taking the worst of it. Visibility 0, can't see the bow from the wheelhouse. Pumps running full, can't keep up with the intake. The voices kept coming. I recognized the pattern from the official reports, the progression. First, the routine weather updates, then the acknowledgement of problems, then the requests for assistance that came faster and more desperate as the situation deteriorated. They were playing in sequence, like a recording stuck on a loop, cycling through the same terrible hour over and over. My throat had gone dry. I reached for the radio, thought about responding, thought about breaking in to tell them, what? That they were already gone? That the ship they were trying to save had been scattered across the lake bed for 50 years? My hand hovered over the transmit button. Didn't press it. Something told me that would be worse, that acknowledging them would be crossing a line I couldn't uncross. The ghost ship hadn't moved, still hung there below the bridge span, bow pointed toward the canal entrance, waiting. The fog swirled around her hull in patterns that didn't match any wind I could feel. Through the control booth windows I could see every detail, the rust streaks down her sides, the ice coating her railings, the running lights that shouldn't be lit. She sat exactly where a ship would stop when requesting bridge clearance, exactly where vessels always paused, waiting for permission to pass through. The radio voices continued their litany of disaster, coordinates, wave heights, hull stress reports, all the clinical language sailors used to describe the moment when Lake Superior decided to take what it wanted. And standing there, listening to dead men call out numbers that hadn't mattered, couldn't have mattered because help never came and the lake never cared, I understood. Rule 5. The words worn away by God knew how many operators who'd stood in this exact spot, facing this exact choice. They'd rubbed those words out deliberately, not from age or handling, from need, from the desperate, repeated checking of men who wanted to make sure they had it right, who needed to verify the instruction one more time before they did what it told them to do, or didn't do. Because that's what Rule 5 must have said, wasn't it? Don't raise the bridge. Don't let it through. Don't give the lake what it's asking for. How many times had this happened? How many November nights had the Fitzgerald appeared in the fog, asking for passage? How many operators had stood where I stood, listening to Austin's voice cycle through those final reports, watching a ship that shouldn't exist wait with impossible patience for clearance that could never come? Enough times to wear the words away. Enough times that someone, Bentley maybe, or the operator before him, or the one before that, had decided the next person shouldn't have to read it, shouldn't have to see the instruction written out plain and know what it meant. Easier to just leave the blank space. Let the new operator figure it out themselves when the moment came. The bridge wanted to rise. I could feel it in the deck beneath my boots, a kind of tension in the steel that shouldn't be there. The whole structure felt coiled, ready. The hydraulic systems were off, the controls locked in neutral, but something in the bridge itself wanted to move. My hands wanted to reach for the panel, wanted it so badly my fingers were actually twitching. Muscle memory from 11 years of responding to vessel requests, trying to override what my brain knew was wrong. A ship was waiting. That's what the bridge was for. That's what I was for. You didn't make vessels wait. You checked your protocols, verified your clearances, and you raised the span, let them through, kept the harbor moving. The Fitzgerald needed to pass. She'd been trying to reach harbor when she went down. 17-foot waves and a November gale, and a hull that couldn't take the stress. She'd split in two somewhere north of Whitefish Point, gone under so fast the crew didn't have time to launch lifeboats. They'd found debris, found pieces, never found the men, never gave them the chance to complete their run. My hand was halfway to the controls before I realized I'd moved. I jerked it back, pressed my palm flat against the cold glass of the window instead, feeling the condensation wet against my skin. Because raising the bridge would open something. I knew that. Knew it the way you know not to touch a hot stove, not to walk on thin ice, not to turn your back on Superior when the wind picked up. The kind of knowledge that lived in your gut, deeper than thought. The rules existed for a reason. Someone had written them. Someone had learned, the hard way probably, because that's how you learned things on the lakes. What happened when you didn't follow the protocols, when you gave in to what seemed reasonable, what seemed right, what seemed like simple human decency. Previous operators had faced this, had made choices, had discovered consequences, and they'd written it down. Rule 5. The instruction that got checked so many times, the words wore away to nothing. Don't raise the bridge. Don't let the ghost ship through. Don't open the passage for something that's already gone. Because if you did, if you threw the switches and engaged the hydraulics and lifted that span, what came through wouldn't be just a ship, wouldn't be just the Fitzgerald completing her final run. It would be everything the lake had taken, every vessel, every crew, every November storm and August calm that had claimed lives and swallowed ships and left nothing behind but coordinates and memorial bells. The weight of that knowledge pressed down on my shoulders, pressed down on my chest, made it hard to breathe in the close air of the control booth. 50 years of ghost ships waiting in the fog. 50 years of November nights when the Fitzgerald appeared and asked for passage. 50 years of operators standing exactly where I stood, listening to Joseph Austin's voice call out coordinates that led nowhere, watching a ship that shouldn't exist wait with the patience of the drowned. 50 years of saying no, of leaving the bridge down and the passage closed, and the dead on the wrong side of whatever line separated their world from ours. My hand was shaking against the glass. Outside, the Fitzgerald waited. Inside, Austin's voice cycled through weather reports that didn't matter anymore. And I stood there, feeling the weight of every operator who'd come before me, every choice they'd made, every night they'd stood watch against something that shouldn't be possible, but was. The weight of knowing what Rule 5 had said, the weight of understanding why the words were gone, the weight of being the one who had to decide right now whether to follow rules I'd never read or raise the bridge and find out what happened when you didn't. My hand moved past the controls, past the lift mechanism, past the hydraulic overrides, past every switch I'd touched in 11 years of night shifts, went straight to the red lever mounted behind protective casing on the booth's right wall, the emergency override. The system that locked the bridge in place regardless of any commands, any pressures, any goddamn thing trying to make it move. I'd tested it exactly once per quarter, per regulations. Pulled it just far enough to verify the mechanism engaged, then reset it before anything actually locked. The casing felt cold under my fingers as I flipped it open. The lever itself was painted safety red, wrapped in textured grip tape that had gone smooth in places from decades of quarterly tests. Bentley's handwriting on the card was still in my peripheral vision. Do not raise the bridge. The Fitzgerald kept rising outside, rust-streaked hull filling my view, water streaming from her deck plates, the fog coiling around her superstructure in patterns that hurt to track. Those voices on the radio, dozens of them, hundreds maybe, all calling out coordinates and bearings and warnings that overlapped into something that sounded almost like singing. I pulled the lever. The mechanism engaged with a sound I felt before I heard it. A grinding shriek of metal on metal that came up through the booth's floor, through the support columns, through every rivet and weld in the bridge's frame. The kind of sound that meant something massive had just stopped moving, something that wanted very badly to move but couldn't. The hydraulic system screamed in protest. Pressure alarms started blaring, high-pitched electronic shrieks that cut through the radio static and the foghorn's lingering resonance. The booth shuddered hard enough that my coffee mug walked itself off the console and shattered on the floor. Hot liquid splashed across my boots. I didn't look down. The bridge deck had started to lift, maybe 3 inches, 4 at most, before the override caught it, locked it solid mid-motion with that grinding shriek still echoing through the framework. Below, the Fitzgerald stopped rising. Just stopped. Not gradual, not settling back. She froze in place like someone had paused a film reel. Water still streaming from her deck, fog still coiling around her hull, but that upward momentum just ended. Hung there for 1 breath, 2, while the pressure alarms kept screaming and my hand stayed locked on that red lever. Then she started to sink. Slow at first. The pilot house descending back into that unnatural fog. The radar mast disappearing, the stack with its faded lettering sliding down past my line of sight. Faster then. The whole superstructure dropping like she'd been released from cables, back toward whatever depth had held her for half a century. The fog swallowed her in thick rolling banks that looked almost solid, almost deliberate in how they wrapped around her hull. The voices on the radio rose to screaming. Not words anymore. Not coordinates or bearings or any kind of language I could parse. Just raw sound. Dozens of throats opened in something between rage and anguish, overlapping into a chorus that made my teeth ache. The booth's speakers rattled with the volume. Static cut through it in jagged bursts, but underneath I could still hear them. All those voices. All that need. The last piece of the Fitzgerald's hull disappeared into the fog. The screaming cut to static. Pure white noise that filled the booth like pressure, like weight. My ears rang with the absence of those voices. The emergency override lever was slick under my palm. Sweat, I realized. My whole hand was shaking. The fog began to thin, not lifting, sinking, settling back down onto the water's surface in thick banks that spread across the harbor mouth, across the canal, until everything below my booth was just gray, formless nothing. The North Pier beacon kept flashing its 4-second rhythm somewhere in that murk. Red pulse, darkness, red pulse. The only proof there was still a world down there. I held that lever for another 10 minutes. Held it until my hand cramped, until the pressure alarms finally shut themselves off, when the system recognized the override wasn't a malfunction. Held it until my legs started shaking from standing locked in place. Every muscle tensed against some impact that never came. The static on the radio faded to silence around 12:15. I let go of the lever then, flexed my fingers until feeling came back. The booth felt too quiet without those voices, without the foghorn's resonance, just the normal sounds. Ventilation system, my own breathing, wind against the windows. The coffee on the floor had stopped steaming. I didn't reset the override. Left it engaged, bridge locked in place, while I sank into my chair and watched that fog slowly dissipate across water that looked black and still and completely ordinary. Dawn came at 7:03. I watched it happen degree by degree, the sky going from black to charcoal to that pale gray that meant morning on the lake in January. The fog had lifted sometime after 3, just thinned and scattered like regular weather, leaving the harbor looking exactly as it should. Freighters waited at anchor in the outer bay, their running lights still visible against the growing daylight. A bulk carrier I recognized, the James R. Barker, sat low in the water about 2 miles out, probably loaded with taconite from the Iron Range. Gulls circled the fish processing plants on the Minnesota side. I could see them through the booth's east windows, white specks against gray buildings, following their usual patterns. The kind of normal that felt obscene after what I'd watched 6 hours earlier. The harbor didn't care. The lake didn't care. Everything just continued like the Fitzgerald hadn't tried to rise from 50 years of cold darkness. Like those voices hadn't screamed through my radio. Like the rules Bentley left me hadn't been the only thing standing between ordinary morning and something I still didn't have words for. The radio crackled at 7:18. Nathan's voice, low and steady. "Bridge, this is museum security." I reached for the handset. My arm felt heavy. Everything felt heavy. "Go ahead, Nathan." "Thought you'd want to know." He paused. Static filled the gap. The bell stopped ringing. I waited. "Happened around 6:30, he continued. "Just stopped. Middle of a sequence. Been silent since." Through the windows I could see the William A. Irvin at her permanent dock, her hull solid and dark against the processing plants behind her. No fog. No unusual light. Just a decommissioned ore boat turned museum piece, exactly as she should be. "You doing all right over there?" Nathan asked. "Yeah," I said. "Long night." "I imagine so." Another pause. "Harbor looks quiet now." "It does." "All right then. Just wanted to let you know about the bell." He signed off with his usual efficiency. No extra words, no questions about what we'd both heard on the radio. What we'd both known was happening out there in the fog. That's how it worked. You reported what needed reporting. Everything else you just carried. I set the handset down and looked at the card mounted beside my console. 5 rules in Bentley's handwriting, that worn spot where a 6th had been before he'd erased it hard enough to tear the paper. My shift ended in 42 minutes. Day operator, a guy named Collins, who'd been working the bridge for maybe 3 years, would take over at 8, and he'd ask why the emergency override was still engaged, and I'd tell him there'd been a mechanical issue during the night that needed inspection before we returned to normal operations. He wouldn't question it. But someone else would work this booth someday. Someone who'd never met Bentley, never learned his rhythms, never understood why certain rules existed. Someone who might not have a card at all if I didn't do what needed doing. I found a pen in the console's top drawer. Black ballpoint, the kind with the Bridge Commission's logo printed on the side. Held it over that worn spot where Bentley's words used to be. My handwriting wouldn't match his. Mine was blockier, less elegant, shaped by years of filling out shift logs and maintenance reports rather than whatever had formed his careful script. But that didn't matter. What mattered was the words. I wrote, "The lake remembers its dead." Some passages must stay closed. Not quite a rule. Not like the others with their clear directives. But true in a way that made my chest tight. In a way that felt like the only honest response to what I'd witnessed. The Fitzgerald had gone down with 29 men, 29 souls who'd fought through 40-foot seas and hurricane winds before the lake took them, and something of them remained. Something that tried to rise, to cross back through, to use the bridge's opening as passage from wherever they'd been trapped for half a century. I'd kept that passage closed. The ink dried quickly in the booth's dry air. I set the pen down and read through all 6 rules again, top to bottom, the way Bentley must have intended. The way every operator who came after me would read them, if they were smart. If they understood that some traditions weren't superstition, but survival. Collins arrived at 7:57. I heard his boots on the stairs, heard him pause at the top to catch his breath the way he always did. He came through the door with coffee in hand, and that easy morning energy of someone who'd slept through the night. "Grayson," he said, "how was it?" Quiet. I stood, gathered my thermos and the sandwich bag I'd never opened. Got the emergency override engaged, had some weird pressure fluctuations around midnight. Might want to have maintenance check the hydraulics before you run any lifts. He frowned, set his coffee down, moved to the console. "Everything locked up okay?" "Solid. Just don't want to risk it until someone's looked at the system." "Fair enough." He was already settling into the routine, checking gauges, scanning the harbor. Wouldn't see anything unusual. Wouldn't have any reason to look at the rules card. Wouldn't notice the sixth line that hadn't been there yesterday. I headed for the door. Grayson? I stopped, turned. Collins was looking at the harbor, not at me. Nathan mentioned some weird radio traffic last night. You hear anything? Atmospheric interference, I said. Happens sometimes in winter. He nodded, accepting it. Why wouldn't he? The harbor looked normal. The lake looked normal. Everything was exactly as it should be, and the alternative, the truth, was something you didn't speak aloud unless you wanted people questioning whether you should be working 60 feet above a shipping canal. I took the stairs slowly. My legs were stiff from standing, from tension, from whatever toll the night had taken that I'd only started to feel now that it was over. The morning air hit me when I pushed through the lower door, cold and clean, carrying the usual sense of lake water and diesel fuel and the fish processing plants when the wind came from the right direction. The harbor spread out before me. Ordinary. Commercial. The kind of working waterfront I'd known my entire adult life. But I left the booth knowing I'd kept something terrible from crossing through. Knowing that the rules Bentley left weren't madness or superstition, but hard-won knowledge written in the only language that mattered. The language of what works when nothing else will. Knowing that some doors, once closed, need to stay that way. The lake was quiet. The dead were back where they belonged. And I walked to my truck, thinking about all the future operators who'd read that card, who'd see 6 rules instead of 5, and maybe, they'd understand before they needed to, before the fog came back, before the bell started ringing, before something rose from the deep asking for passage we could never grant.